Greetings, everyone. My name is Larry Diamond. I'm a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. I've had the good fortune for collaborating, I think, and interacting for more than 20 years now with the director of the Iranian Studies Program, the co-director of the Iran Democracy Project, and a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, Abbas Milani, who will be our first speaker today and is the organizer of this panel and so much else. I'm going to introduce the other speakers, with one exception, in the order in which they will follow the first set of observations by Dr. Milani, and they are as follows. Speaking next will be Mateen Mira-Mizani, who's managing the Stanford Iran 2040 project, which is part of the Iranian Studies program, and he is a Stanford alum. He'll be followed by another Stanford alum, Mobina Riazi, who holds a bachelor's in political science from Stanford and a minor in Iranian studies. She's currently a master's student in communications. She'll be followed by Sam Samani, who is a graduating senior at Stanford, majoring in political science and minoring in Iranian studies. Following Sam will be Bailey Olbricht, who earned her JD from Stanford and is currently the founding executive director of the Stanford Humanitarian Program. And she'll be speaking about some of the international legal implications. And our last speaker will be Michael McFall, my dear friend, and the recent former director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, a senior fellow at FSI and at Hoover, and a professor of political science. Before we kick off our present speakers with Abbas Milani, I want to introduce a dear friend to our effort, H.R. McMaster, the former National Security Advisor of the U.S. and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and FSI and a lecturer at Stanford's Business School. HR has kindly given us a little video to start our program. He recorded it from abroad, so the quality may not be perfect, but the spirit will be. So let's go to that video first.
Well, hello. It's great to be together with you and at the Iranian Studies program at this critical time when we've seen, unspeakable brutality, mass murder of the Iranian people by the theocratic dictatorship in Tehran. And so, what I'd like to talk about is how important it is for us to act at this moment, to really do two fundamental things. One is to weaken the Iranian regime and to weaken its ability to use its tools of coercion. And the second is to strengthen those who are challenging this regime and who are advocating for freedom and liberty. And so I'd like to offer a few thoughts about why it's important to act at this moment, and then what we can do to act. First, it's important to act for all humanity, for the Iranian people, to ensure that these crimes against humanity cannot continue. But also, the theocratic dictatorship in Iran is part of an axis of authoritarians who are aiding and abetting each other. China is at the foundation of this axis of authoritarians. China underwrites so many of these authoritarian regimes around the world, from Venezuela to Nicaragua to Cuba to Russia. You could say that China is in many ways using the other revanchist or revisionist dictatorship on the Eurasian landmass of Russia to fight a proxy war against our free and open societies, and in particular Europe and by connection and the United States and the transatlantic alliance. And of course, China also helps by exporting its technologically enabled Orwellian police state. You see also the assistance that Russia has provided the theocratic dictatorship in Iran as well. So it's important for the entire free world to really act in these two areas, to weaken the regime's ability to apply these tools of coercion and to strengthen those who are advocating for freedom and for liberty. So what should we do? Our colleague here at Hoover, Stephen Cocken, has done fantastic work on studying the authoritarian of authoritarians, Joseph Stalin. And through his scholarship, he's identified really 5 key sources of strength and support for authoritarian regimes. The first of these is cash flow. We can restrict further the cash flow available to the regime with the ghost fleet, with imposing costs on those who are feeding the regime's ATM with energy purchases, and by doing a more effective job at going after the illicit economy and illicit financial transactions. Second thing that they need is security forces. We can act against those security forces directly, or we can act to try to peel them apart and separate them. Those Iranians who are in the opposition know more about the possibility about doing this. But we should look for opportunities to weaken the security forces, go after their communications ability, go after their ability to access data, to use the surveillance state to continue this oppression. Cut them off, from further weapons like Russia's exporting to them attack helicopters and armored vehicles in recent months, which we know are meant to be used internally as well. So weaken the security forces, try to splinter the security forces. We saw a little bit of that during Iran's 12-day campaign and the targeting some of the worst IRGC general officers. The third thing that they need is they need control over life choices. We should be working to give Iranians other alternatives in certain parts of the country, certainly among those expatriates, and helping to demonstrate to the population that they could have much more freedom and control over their lives if they're able to overthrow this repressive regime. The fourth thing that they need that Cocken identifies is that they need stories to tell their people through the control of media. Hey, you need us to protect you, from the Zionist Crusader conspiracy. To say that the hell that they have created in Iran is due to anyone other than themselves who created this hell, but by their oppression, their neglect, their thievery, the corrupt nature of these bunyads and the way that they divert the wealth from the Iranian people. So we need to communicate more effectively. We need to get around the regime's firewalls and be able to reach people with alternative sources of information, but also, as we saw, so important to be able to access information from the Iranian people directly. And the fifth thing that they need, according to Cocken, is an international system that provides these authoritarians with some support. As I mentioned, they get that from China. They get that from Russia. They were getting it from Venezuela to a certain extent, and so forth. So work from the outside in to break apart the support for this regime. After murdering, we think, we know tens of thousands of people, maybe 30,000 people, there should be international outrage about this. And it should be shameful for any country to have diplomatic relations even with Iran at this point. Why are there any Iranian embassies and consulates still open in the world, for example? So this is what can be done to weaken the regime. And then we have to think about what we can do to support those who are fighting for their lives through financial support. How do we transfer financial support to them to assist them? Informational support, as I mentioned, extremely important as well. But then communication support, so the regime can never again shut down the communications. And then what I'll suggest finally is that, these regimes are brittle. These authoritarian regimes, they look strong. They often look really good on parade, right? But actually, as we've seen, they're quite brittle. And so it's important, I think, important for us to 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 bolster the Iranian people after they've suffered so tremendously in the last month, and then to work against these regimes actively, and those who support them to work against them actively. So I can't tell you what a pleasure it's been to be with you. I know that you're learning a lot from this session, but I would ask all of us to think, hey, what can we do? What can we do to act in these two areas to weaken the regime and to support those who are quite literally fighting for their lives in Iran? Thank you for the privilege of being with you.
Well, I feel that HR really was with us live. That was quite amazing. So I'm sure these will iterate through a number of the presentations, but also the discussion to follow. And we began with the international dimension, and we'll close with it when we come to Mike. But first, we'll start through our list of other speakers, beginning with Abbas Malani. Abbas?
Uh, uh, Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining with us. I want to begin by thanking HR McMaster, Larry Diamond, and Mike McFall, who have worked all the time from the moment this crisis began. I heard from Larry and I heard from Mike, and they said, let's do something about this. And there are other colleagues at Stanford University who offered help. Amir Eshel from Comparative Literature, Russell Berman from Hoover. There are many people. And we thought we organized this event to first think about it seriously, but show that contrary to this eerie silence that the international community often has picked about this, there is concern. There are serious people. H.R. McMaster spent time to get to this conference from his travel. So I am humbled by the help of our colleagues, our students, and I want to tell anyone who is watching, don't be disheartened by the silence you might feel. First of all, be emboldened by the bravery of the Iranian people. This oppression is awful, but it is more than anything else a sign of the bravery of the Iranian people. It's a sign of their brutality, but this regime uses brutality commensurate with the challenge that people have. And this challenge is unprecedented. And this challenge is unprecedented after 44 years of people struggling, of people being beaten. You can see the history of this regime from 45 years ago is a history of struggle, suppression, struggle again. And you can see an escalating cycle. Every time they suppress, the next time, next year, 2 years, there is a bigger uprising and there is a bigger suppression. This has been the biggest uprising and it has thus been the biggest, but it is a threshold event. Even with their criminal record, this time I think they have gone so far that have essentially broken all records within not just their sordid history, but the troubled history of Iran in the last 150 years. There is no commensurate, comparable event. A scholar who works in Iran, who works with the regime, who is a supporter of the regime, a critical supporter of the regime. The first conference Larry Diamond, Mike McFall, and I organized at Stanford some 20 years ago, we invited him to give a talk. He didn't make it, he didn't get a visa. He has accumulated, based on the data that the Iranian regime offered him, his name is Ahmad Baghi, that from June 1963 till the end of the Pahlavi regime and the rise of the clerical regime, the total number of people killed for political reasons in Iran is about 1,300. This time they have killed several thousand. The number ranges from 16,000 reported. The same gentleman who reported the 16,000 in another conference said the number can be up to 60,000. The regime has accepted already 3,000. That is unprecedented. And I think it is unprecedented because they know, Khamenei knows, that they're at the end of their period. Many people within the regime have recognized this. Again, Larry and I organized a panel 3 years ago about what is the sign that the regime is about to fall. These are on our websites. Please go and watch them. And Larry and Mike, world experts on this question of transition to democracy, outlined what those indicators are. Iran is very, very near having all of those characteristics. And one of the most important characteristics is signs of fracture within the regime. The military apparatus hasn't completely shown any indication of fracture. By military, I mean the IRGC, but clearly you see signs that they are having second thoughts. You see signs that someone as conservative as Rouhani has come out and said, this game has to finish. There are increasing signs that many people within the regime no longer believe the status quo is tenable. And thus, internationally, as HR said, as Mike will say, the time is ripe. The time is ripe to help Iranians help themselves and deliver this country. There cannot be democracy in the Middle East, and there certainly cannot be a lack of anxiety about Iran's nuclear program without democracy in the Middle East. That's why I was very, very, very surprised that the Trump administration decided to have a negotiation with this regime at this time, knowing in advance that they are on record saying that they're not going to compromise on the things that the Trump administration wants them to compromise. Making these gestures only helps this regime. This regime needed to tell its lunatic fringe, the murderous people who went at the people of Iran, that the international community still supports us, that the United States still wants negotiation with us. This regime has given an Orwellian narrative of the recent history of Iran to its base. They think they won the 12-day war. Khamenei literally says, we defeated Israel, we defeated the United States at the end of the 12-day war. And they went, and I'm verbatim quoting a site, put a paper on Khamenei's site 2 days ago, that 10 intelligence agencies led by Mossad and CIA went together, 10 of them, and planned this uprising, which he calls a coup. Millions of people have come to the streets. According to the own regime, 3,000 have been killed, and he calls it a coup. So this is an incorrigible, this is not a regime that can correct itself. It does not learn a lesson. It is a bully, and it will continue to bully the people of Iran. Hopefully, the end, I think, is near. We're to talk 5 minutes, but we have a question and answer period. And if
Great.
there are questions that I can answer, I'll be glad to be at your service.
Thank you so much, Abbas. And now we'll go to Mateen Miramazani.
Thank you so much. Speaking of the signals, I think I want to start by saying that at the Iran 2040 project, we've been really looking at the various aspects of development in Iran, whether it's quite obviously the economy itself, whether it's the food and agricultural sector, whether it's the flight of a huge amount of human capital, whether it's the banking system, whether it's the energy sector. As we've looked at these, I think the convergence of the collapse of various aspects of Iranian life is unfortunately not very surprising. We recently completed a project that we presented earlier this week, and we'll be publishing it hopefully in the next coming days. And we wanted to really look at how those have shown up in terms of people's demands. We decided to undertake a project looking at the occurrence of protests in Iran, given the massive kind of size of the country. We focused on the capital, Tehran itself. We went through over 100,000, about 100,000 videos, images. We went through social media posts. We went through news reports. We really narrowed it down to a set of concrete evidence of protests and ended up with about 8,500 observations of protests from 2009 up to about the end of 2024. And we found evidence for over 2,100 days of protests in just Tehran that we were able to verifiably find documentation for over 16 years, which translates to about having a protest one every 3 days. So, you pick on average any day on the calendar, the day before, the day after, one of those 3 days, there was a protest happening in Tehran that we know of and we have documentation for. That obviously has changed over the years. In the year 2023, which was in the wave of the Mahsa Amini protests and uprising, we had almost two out of every 3 days, there was a protest in Tehran. I think a lot of people who aren't necessarily close watchers of Iran, present company excluded, um, perhaps know of the major protests that we've seen, those major protests in the Green Movement in 2009. You might have seen the protests of Day, of Alban protests in 2020, or the Mahsa Amini uprising. And those really function as, I would analogize them to more of those kinds of tsunami events where, they're instigated in very surprising ways. They have a massive size and scope, and they really spread all across the country. And those are particularly important, but also in the backdrop, we know of continuous demands for change happening in Iran to improve the conditions of the economy, to improve the conditions of the environment, for people to have, to be able to live their life in accessible ways. We have so many diverse set of demands and needs. And when we look at these, whether we were looking at the empirical data from the development, from the economy, from any aspect of Iran's, evolution and functioning as a country, or whether we're looking at the protests themselves specifically and we're tracking the evolution of how those have changed, what's really clear is they both point to the same direction, which is the convergence of the failure of the government to provide for the people, to meet their political demands, to meet their social demands, to meet their economic demands. And as a result of that, we're also seeing the loss of legitimacy by the government. We see people feeling desperate. We see people feeling no other alternative but to really change the structure of the system that's not meeting their needs. And I think that is kind of manifesting itself in the way that Dr. Milani was saying, in massive, widespread protests. I think what's very unique, even about these protests compared to the past waves, even those major tsunami waves, is although we haven't been able to collect any empirical evidence, and the total shutdown of the internet for almost 2 weeks was a big factor in that. We can confidently say this was perhaps the largest set of protests we've seen in the country since 1979. Happening all across the country, people coming from a variety of social classes with a variety of demands, whether it's economic, political, or social. And a lot of what we see is not just reflected in the numbers that we see, but also we see it in the discourse of the protests. In our study, we also track the chants that people have been using. And there is a notion that Iranian people have just started to make stronger demands, but we see people calling for radical revolutionary changes, changes to the structure of the regime since 2009 all the way to today. We see people really addressing Mr. Khamenei himself, specifically calling for his ouster since 2009. And we're seeing those sentiments really growing over time and persisting. And I think now we're just seeing all of that bubbling, that everything that has bubbled up over the years and everything that has accumulated over the years, getting us to where we are today. And look forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say and your questions.
Hello, I want to thank everybody for being here today. I want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the media landscape, and I'll start with talking about what we're seeing in our own major news outlets regarding these protests and the framing as a responsive movement to economic collapse. And while that's true, we can't deny that these are also fundamentally about freedom, economic freedom, social freedom, and freedom of personhood. And for me, these violations of freedoms culminate in the regime's consistent and targeted repression of the people's ability to connect with each other, with the outside world, and to express themselves. And that's exactly what millions of Iranians are fighting for as we speak. And I want to also contextualize a bit here Iran's media environment and landscape. Um, According to the World Bank, data from 2021, almost 80% of Iranians use the internet. According to data from the Iranian Student News Agency from 2024, almost 50 million Iranians are on WhatsApp, Telegram, Instagram. And these numbers matter because they highlight how central digital platforms are to everyday life in Iran, not only socially for commerce, communication, but politically. The state has invested heavily on building its own internet infrastructure and has repeatedly attempted to promote domestic versions of these platforms. But Iranians are simply not interested. They would rather pay expensive VPN bills to access free platforms, to connect with the rest of the world, and to escape the state sponsored media and continue to do so when these nationwide protests come and inevitably these internet blackouts follow. Most recently, the internet blackout that began on January 8th, we see Iranians continuing to reach the outside world through any means possible. Phone landlines, Starlink, and other VPNs that are meeting this demand. And this connection and exchange of information is so fundamental that the regime is actively now stopping people in the streets and checking their phones, making sure that they have no videos, no footage, no text messages with anyone in the outside world. I know my family members in Iran have deleted any evidence of the protests that they had. And this is all just because we've seen how powerful that communication can be. So for me, what we're witnessing in Iran today is not only the repression of protesters in the streets, but repression of connection, of certainty, and collective memory. And that I think is essential to understanding both the scale of what's happening and why it resonates so deeply with those outside of Iran, with all the panelists here and those of you attending this webinar. So I look forward to answering any other questions you might have. I'll pass it on to some.
Thank you so much, Mobina, for sharing that. And next, we turn to a current Stanford undergraduate. Mobina is a master's student. Sam Samani is, as I said, a senior, going to graduate in a couple quarters. Go ahead, Sam.
Thank you, Professor Diamond, and thank you again, everyone, for attending this. I think one of our main goals with this is to really raise awareness, and I think one of the most brilliant things about this, about allowing me and Mobina to speak, is to show just how much not only do academics, policy professionals, but how much students care about this topic. And One thing I've been focusing on is kind of what are the internal dynamics right now with these protests going on as we speak. I think one of the most important things to understand about these recent protests is that they stem from they began with the Bazari class. Now, these are a group of traditional merchant class in Iran that have historically been stalwart supporters of the regime. And it is they who begun these protests, which later on went on to include ethnic minorities, women, youth, and very importantly, something people haven't touched on is people who are employed by the public sector. Not only are these people who are rising up in protest risking their lives, risking being imprisoned or being injured, but they are risking losing a source of income in an economy where being able to buy meat is a luxury. And I think this is something uh, that really is indicative of a complete loss of legitimacy. You know, it's akin to the Democrats losing California. Your single most stalwart constituency is turning against you and is becoming the first to actually rise up and protest. And I think we are seeing this loss of legitimacy also be reflected in elite fractionalization, as Dr. Milani pointed out. I mean, it is overtly clear to me that there is not a single cohesive narrative, even among regime hardliners, on how to address the current internal dynamics. Whether it be the nuclear negotiations, which clearly Shamkhani has a completely different view on compared to other hardliners, or whether it be addressing the protesters, who even Dr. Milani pointed out, people such as Rouhani have come out and expressly disavowed them. And this all leads to kind of what I would see as a indication that the gig is up. And I think the best example of this is you look at President Pezeshkian. You look at the statements he made both 2 years ago during the time of the mandatory hijab laws and now. It's very clear to everyone who can listen to him or read the transcripts from his speeches that he's kind of admitted that not only does he not have any power, but that most of the policies of this regime are impracticable and not likely to actually, be implemented or be effective. And he, in many ways, has admitted that the gig is up. The president of the country. Uh, and if we extrapolate from that we've seen recently multiple diplomatic defections from Iranian diplomats in Europe. There are some credible reports saying that at least two have defected, left the diplomatic missions to which they were attached. And I think this is significant because you could kind of see that they're hedging their bets and getting the heck out of Dodge while they can. And this is just one kind of small example. Um, and so what I think is very clear is leak fractionalization has already been existent and now it's increasing. It's becoming worse, and there is an overcompensation happening. Right now, you can see reports of the Majlis comparing Khomeini to Moses and Trump to Pharaoh. The leader of the Behesht Zahra cemetery in Tehran has said, "I've made 5,000 new graves to house American soldiers." Right. So this kind of overcompensation is a Freudian slip of nation state proportions. And Pezeshkian's behavior, their overcompensation, diplomats beginning to defect, not a single clear narrative being present, all leads me to believe that the regime's elite are now less united and weaker than they ever have been before.
Thank you so much, both of you, for your insights and your discipline. Before I turn to our last two speakers, I want to say to our audience that you can feel free to pose questions in the Q&A box if you would like to. And Bailey Obrucht, you're next.
Thank you, Dr. Diamond. I am going to try to contextualize some of what we just heard within the context of international law. I'm going to focus just briefly on international human rights law and international criminal law, and then I'll turn a little bit to international law that governs the use of force, because the Trump administration in the past couple of weeks has suggested that it may use force in Iran in response to the ongoing human rights violations that are happening. So first, I think it's, indisputable that Iran's current actions have violated its treaty obligations under international human rights law. Iran has ratified several international human rights treaties. Among them are the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the Convention for the Rights of the Child. Um, the Iran's violations recently include the violation of the right to free speech and free assembly, prohibition on enforced disappearances and torture, as well as extrajudicial killings. There's a bigger question, which is whether or not Iran has also committed a crime against humanity here. A crime against humanity must involve specific acts that are committed as part of a broader pattern of widespread and systematic attacks against civilians that are pursuant to or in furtherance of a state policy and are attributable to state organs or agents. I think we're looking at, highly probable crimes against humanity here. Potentially, some possible crimes against humanity that we may be seeing are torture, imprisonment, and murder, as well as persecution on political or possibly religious or even gender grounds. The big question mark in terms of gathering evidence is whether or not international human rights groups and Iranians themselves can prove that these acts were committed pursuant to or in furtherance of a state policy. And that remains to be seen, but I think it's, the evidence, at least circumstantial evidence, will, point in the direction of these acts being coordinated and sophisticated measure directed by official state policy. This is also happening in the context, it's worth just noting briefly, of international human rights groups and Iranians themselves arguing that what happened during the Women Life Freedom movement in Iran amounted to a crime against humanity of gender persecution. And that is an ongoing effort by international human rights groups to push for accountability in that realm. So this wouldn't be an unprecedented claim within Iran. So that's a little bit about the context of within international human rights law. The other layer of this is what's the legality of the U.S. potentially using force here? The Trump administration has threatened to use force, but it hasn't actually clarified what it would be using force to accomplish, so what its objectives would be. And it also hasn't clarified what justification it would be using to use force. So this is leaving us to essentially guess what the Trump administration would be trying to accomplish here. One possibility is that the U.S. would claim that they're using force in self-defense. Self-defense traditionally is, in response to an armed attack, which we have not faced from Iran. So it's possible that the Trump administration would argue that the U.S. is instead using force in preemptive self-defense, possibly in relation to the Iranian government's efforts to build a nuclear weapon. Preemptive self-defense is a highly controversial argument under international law, though. There isn't a lot of, there certainly isn't widespread state support for this argument, and it remains quite contested. Some scholars have argued that potentially there's an argument to be made in favor of preemptive self-defense legally where there's a threat of a specific and imminent attack. But I don't see evidence of that here, at least against the US. And I think more broadly, there's, a lot of doubt that the idea that preemptive self-defense could support legally justify under international law U.S. use of force. It's also worth noting that the IAEA reported in October that Iran hasn't enriched any uranium since the attacks in June 2025. So the idea that the building a nuclear weapon would amount to an imminent threat to the U.S. is, I think, not supported in current evidence. A second potential international law argument that I've heard floating around is this idea that the U.S. could use military force under a supposed responsibility to protect. And the responsibility to protect basically is a relatively new legal concept that argues that states have a responsibility to protect their populations from mass atrocities. And where they're unwilling or unable to do so, other states, the international community, can kind of step in and try to protect that population from mass atrocities. The responsibility to protect prioritizes non-military actions. And I think there's, some support among state practice to, in support of non-military means under the idea of responsibility to protect in response to mass atrocities. The use of military force, though, is quite contested. It's even contested within the UN Security Council. So there's only been one time where the UN Security Council authorized the use of military force under this responsibility to protect, and that was in Libya in 2011. Since then, there's been a lot of contestation among states that the UN Security Council shouldn't actually, authorize use of military force. Obviously, one could disagree with that, but it does remain contested. There's even less support for the idea that a state could unilaterally use force under this concept of a responsibility to protect. Even in Syria, where there was, widespread documentation of war crimes, no state that entered Syria used a responsibility to protect justification. They all used a self-defense argument. So this hesitation to use responsibility to protect, I think, suggests that a responsibility to protect is not yet crystallized in international law and shouldn't be used as an international legal justification. Also, just say that, we're facing a world in which the prohibition on the use of force is radically being undermined. So advocating for further undermining that prohibition risks kind of opening up the floodgates. So I caution against kind of relying on that as support for unilateral use of force justification. But that doesn't mean there are no options. And I think all the panelists here can talk about what those options non-military options might be, including international legal accountability.
Thank you so much. Obviously, I'm taking notes here, so because it's so captivating, I want to remember the amazing things you're saying. So I had my audio off for a second. Mike, we're going to conclude with you. Take it home for us.
Well, great. Thanks, Larry. And thanks for inviting me here. Thanks, Abbas, for hosting this. And I'm especially inspired by former and current students from Stanford participating here. Sometimes in the press, there's lots of commentary that says nobody cares about Iran, and our American students on our campuses don't care about what's happening in Iran. And I think you're seeing evidence in this webinar that that is not true, at least not here at Stanford. I'm going to be brief because I want to get to questions. I wanted to talk about the role of the international community and the Trump administration in particular in what could be done. HR has already talked a little bit about that. The way I think, and I've written about other democratic transitions and failed transitions as well, and I want to emphasize, I am not an expert on Iran. We have many experts on Iran on this call, so I'm going to speak more abstractly. But when you have a moment of contestation, like you do, about who are the legitimate rulers of a country, think about it as a war and a balance of power between the old regime and the democratic forces. And therefore, if you want to help a democratic transition in a time of this confrontation where there are two different sides claiming sovereignty over the same state, I'm thinking of Charles Tilly's theories here, for those of you who are academics, then the outsiders need to shift the balance of power in favor of the democratic opposition, to state the obvious, either so that they overwhelm the ancien regime. That doesn't happen very often, by the way, or they create a stalemate in terms of the balance of power between the challengers and the ancien regime. And when that happens, that's when you see moments for pacted transitions. So moderates, those that want to just save their skin from the old order, interact with opposition leaders, and those are pacted transitions. So either full replacement of the regime or stalemate leading to a pacted transition. And therefore, Trump administration, I'll keep my remarks to Trump, but I would include the Europeans, I would include all governments that want to see a democratic transition in Iran. We need to do all that we can to shift the balance of power in favor of small d Democrats. And what I am scared to death of and deeply troubled by is that I am worried that the Trump administration is going to do exactly the opposite. That in their signaling that they want to meet, there's evidently there's going to be meetings on Friday, that all they talk about is they want a nuclear deal with the theocrats, with this incredibly repressive dictatorship. And I have two qualms with that. Number one, they told us last June that our bombing campaign was so effective that we wiped out the Iran nuclear program. So why do we need to go negotiate with them now? Why do we need to go back to them right now, of all times? One of those things cannot be true. Were they not telling us the truth about the effectiveness of that bombing campaign? But number two, more importantly, any negotiation with this illegitimate regime is throwing a lifeline to this regime at a time when all the other experts that have spoken before me have shown you data that this is the weakest the regime has ever been. So I'm not against negotiations over nuclear weapons programs. I'm not against ending support for terrorism in this regime. But to me, this is exactly the wrong time to be negotiating with this regime. Because in my analysis, written with Abbas and Larry for many decades, if you really want to end the Iran threat to the region through our allies in the region and to the United States, the best way to do that is to support a new democratic regime. That's the best way to get rid of those threats. And therefore, I'm deeply nervous about negotiations over things that we shouldn't want because they shouldn't be available to this regime because allegedly we already eliminated them. Now, critics of my position that I interact with say, Mike, there's no way we can do anything. There's nothing we can do. And if we help along the lines you're talking about, two things can happen. And traditionally, these are the kind of arguments that are made. Either more radicals come to power and the destruction of the current regime leads to even worse outcomes, civil war, wars against their neighbors. I would just say I've heard these arguments before in many other cases, and maybe in questions we can talk about them, and they're always overestimated. Especially this notion that the radicals can come into power. The radicals are in power in Iran. I can't imagine a more radical regime, but maybe that's because I'm not don't know the case as well. But I've heard these arguments before, especially about communists taking over. If we support democracy during the Cold War, that turned out not to be true. And same with this collapse of the state will make worse off. I just could point to many cases where that was made the argument and it wasn't true. But if you wanted to help change the balance of power, there are actually very concrete things that can do. And I'm going to tick off 3 things to help opposition and 3 to weaken the regime and stop, echoing some of the things that HR said. So 1, provide communication systems to the opposition. Smuggle in all kinds of Starlink terminals. And there are many other things that could be done very concretely to weaken this barricade of information. 2, through various different mechanisms, and we can go through them in questions, provide more concrete financial assistance to groups inside Iran and outside of Iran that are trying to strengthen the opposition. And then 3, symbolically show that we support the democratic forces. Maybe it's happened, but I don't think I've ever seen a meeting with President Trump and human rights activists from Iran in the diaspora, for instance. And I think symbolically signaling that we value these people. Abbas Milani should go to the White House next week. I want to be very concrete. I would like to see that photo so that we're signaling that we support not just financially, but symbolically, a different set of forces inside Iran. And in terms of weakening the regime, HR's already said some things, but one, there are many, many more sanctions that could be imposed against the regime, against the supreme leader, against his family, across the board, eliminating embassies, eliminating diplomatic contact for those countries that still have them. There's so much more that could be done to sanction the regime. 2, freeze their assets. This is what we did with respect to Russian assets abroad when Putin invaded Ukraine. That could be done in a comprehensive way, and they could only be lifted after there's a democratic transition. And third, more radically, but stop the sale of energy, oil and gas, to the outside world. The most aggressive way would be an embargo. That is an aggressive act, I understand, but there are other ways to do it. For instance, allow the sale for Iranian oil abroad, but don't allow the transfer for the payment of that. Put that in an escrow account, let it build up, and say it will be released only when there is a democratic transition in Iran. And I could go through a lot more, but I think in the interest of time, I'll stop with those three concrete ideas to help the opposition and three concrete ideas to weaken the autocratic regime, the horrific, bloods on their hand, despotic regime that is currently oppressing the Iranian people inside Iran.
Okay, thank you so much. Abbas, are we allowed to run a little over because we got a lot of questions and we need a little more time?
Of course. You're the
Well,
boss.
I think we should try and keep it to only a few minutes over. Let me just make the only comment I'm going to make myself as a moderator, because it's really not my role. But the National Endowment for Democracy is providing some of this assistance on the ground right now in Iran. I'm not going to be specific, but they're using very creative ways to do it. And one thing I know from talking to its president, Damon Wilson, recently is they got about $3 million of requests and needs that they can't fund. One thing that we could do almost immediately that would make a tangible difference on the ground is for the Congress just to do what it's done sometimes in the past and add on a special appropriation to the National Endowment for Democracy to increase its programmatic support for actors in this crisis situation. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is pose 6 questions, and I want each of our panelists to write down 2 of them, and only 2 that they will answer. I'm going to shift the order a little bit. So a set of questions involves the organizational structure and leadership of the opposition. Is there really any kind of legitimate alternative? What do we know about the structure of leadership on the ground in Iran? Or is it just, the leaderless movements of the Arab Spring, which in the end mainly led nowhere? And then there's a specific question about the role of Reza Pahlavi in this regard. Secondly, maybe this is for Mobina. What technical innovations could help Iranians more safely connect to the internet? A third, possibly, this is for Mateen. What is the status and scenario, going directly to Mike's last point, of Iran's oil resources now? And what do we know about what it's selling on international markets? Fourth, I'm going to have to ask them all at once. You're going to have one round collectively to answer all these. What can international actors do? And Mike, of course, has given a lot of suggestions. But also, there's a couple of people asking, what can the Iranian diaspora do to help the opposition and divide the regime, to work on those 2 principles? And related to that, there is a comment here, which I must say, I think is a serious one, that we talk in very general terms and maybe very aspirational terms about fractures in the regime. But most of the time, there's very little specific and often sounds, frankly, rather aspirational. And the point here, which I think is a deeply insightful one, is this really going to go anywhere unless there's a deal on the table for a lot of these people that gives them safe passage into exile if they leave? And Mike, I've got a question for you. A lot of what you were saying about avoiding Iran nuclear deal sounds a lot like what the conservatives and the neocons were saying during the Obama administration when President Obama was doing a nuclear deal with Iran and being criticized for abandoning the democracy movement. I get a little bit of a feeling like Democrats and Republicans have switched places now. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that. I'm going to start with Abbas, and why don't you
Okay.
just raise your hands as you want to answer these things?
My first comment is that if President Trump wants to meet with the leader of the human rights movement or the opposition, he shouldn't meet with me. There are many people who are much more qualified than me. There's a Nobel Prize winner, there is a Crown Prince, there are all kinds of people. I'm just a small teacher sitting here. But the opposition, I think, there is, I think, now a very powerful opposition outside Iran and inside Iran. I can say with confidence that the opposition outside Iran has never been as organized, as mobilized as now. 2 days ago, 3 days ago, there were about 150,000 people in Toronto. It's remarkable. I think maybe there's 170,000 people in Toronto, Iranians in Toronto. They came out with enormous discipline and even cleaned the streets after they finished the demonstration. And there are other demonstrations in other places. And there is not one leadership, but I think there is an emerging consensus that the symbol, not the leader of this, but the symbol of this transition can be the Crown Prince if he goes to what has been his historic message that I want to help this process get to the next stage, have free and fair election. I don't have any claim. Some of his supporters say he is the king, but he keeps repeating, don't call me a king, but they don't listen. That from outside, I think, has emerged as a potential unifying force. And in Iran, there are many, many people who are actually have been fighting this regime. I mean, you can't have a democratic transition, in my view, without the role of someone like Narges Mohammadi. Again, some people out in the diaspora have taken the hammer to her. I think it's absolutely counterproductive. Without people like Narges Mohammadi, Nasrin Sotoudeh, Toumaj Salehi, people who have spent years in prison, we cannot bring this coalition together to overthrow this regime. And I have no doubt that one of the central forces for creating dissension between inside and outside between different forces, the social democrats and the royalists and the extreme royalists and the monarchists, all of these, is the Iranian regime. To me, the role that I wrote actually a piece in foreign policy where I basically say that the Crown Prince has said for 40 years that I don't have any claim to an authority. I don't have any claim to a position. I want to help this transition. And we go back to Iran and we have a free, fair election, open election, and decide what the next stage would be. And I do think it's different than before. I absolutely, you have people calling out directly to Khamenei. Karoubi, who was in prison for 11 years, comes out and says, this is not a radical element. This is someone from within the regime. This is someone who wants to preserve essentially this regime. He calls out Khamenei by name. He said, you are the source of all problems. Rouhani more or less says the same thing. Someone called Qadeyani, who's been in prison for 10 years. For 3 years, he's been saying from inside the prison. He's now inside the prison. He says, Khamenei, you are the source of all problems. You are the enemy. We got to get rid of you. And we got to get a new system. This is unheard of, would have been unimaginable 5 years ago. So it is different. And the weakness of the regime is also unprecedented. They don't have the money to pay for this oppressive apparatus. They might have been running out of the oppressive apparatus. There is credible evidence that they brought in forces from Hashr al-Sha'bi in Iraq, from Hezbollah to suppress the people. There are credible sources that the people who were involved in these mass killings are now being pressured from their neighbors. I heard just 2 nights ago in the city of Mashhad, where they took one of the most holy cities, is one of the most horrible places. And in some neighborhoods, people are pressuring the Basijis who were involved in murder to get out. So there is unprecedented uh, level of fracture, but in order to get to the next step, we need all the help that Mike mentioned, you mentioned, HR General McMaster mentioned, uh, to, and we need the prudence. We need the prudence. As you said, we can't threaten everybody who is in Iran, as some of the opposition outside do, that if we come to power, we're going to hang all of you, we're going to hang you, we're going to do this and that. They're not going to give up. A pact of transition happens when you give these people who have come to some conclusion a way to join the forces to overthrow this regime. And we do have till at least 4:30, Larry, at the time, and we can go a few minutes more if you decide. You're the boss.
Thank you, Abbas. And Martin, we'll go to you next.
Great. Yeah, I think on the oil resources, and I think this kind of points to some of the kind of conditions that give more context to the current circumstances is, according to the data from the Iranian central bank, the Iranian government sold about $65 billion of oil and oil related exports in the year preceding in the previous Iranian calendar year, which actually ended in March of 2025. That's a significant amount of sales. That's the same amount of oil that Iran sold in terms of in the aftermath of the JCPOA. It's before that, the same peak was in 2012. So the idea that these circumstances were created in the highest levels of sanctions, and those are essentially to blame for the current state of the economy is not true in so many levels, but not true in the same in the fact that empirically, when we look at the amount of exports during in the aftermath of JCPOA, they were at the same levels. And I think that also shows us how dire the circumstances are, and why we're here, why we are, despite the amount of sales that they have done and this was a number that was picking up in the 4 year prior to the previous 4 years. I think although the Biden administration did not change much of its rhetoric on Iran, the data shows that it might have relaxed some of the enforcement of sanctions, or maybe the Iranian government improved its implementation of circumventing the sanctions. It's hard to tell from without kind of more insight. We know that despite that, the government is still struggling, and that the current harsh conditions that people are facing is with that amount of sales. So there is definitely a need that's more structural and significant than just a simple kind of fix and a simple reform. The other piece I'll say is that also indicates the tools that the international community has, that the United States has, for putting pressure on the regime have been very much underutilized. And I think that's a point that a lot of the people on this call, Dr. Milani, Professor McFall, I think, have really echoed, that we've really not utilized a lot of these tools, and there is still a lot to be done, and it's quite honestly shameful that there has been so little done, even now in the aftermath of so many people kind of coming out to protest, so much happening in Iran, so much happening in the international community, and so much of the problems that the Iranian regime has created in the international community, and we're still. It feels like we're still at this point where we're still kind of having the same replay of 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And I think that really called for a really rethinking of and getting serious about how we approach the policy toward Iran. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, good. We got 9 minutes, so we got to keep moving along. Mobina?
Yeah, I'll answer the question about access to the internet and communication channels. I think like one thing we've seen is direct to cell connection is really important. Starlink is really important. It's still not largely accessible. So we've seen people are struggling to get information out. I think other things that are like important to consider, like there are countries in the region that can target state communication channels and state monitoring of dissent. And that's something that is a route that can be taken to support protesters and their freedom to connect with each other in the outside world. And um, I think another thing that could be done is like social media platforms coming out and saying that they're not sharing data. I mean, that's something that we can understand, but in Iran, that's a fear that a lot of people have. Is like, is my conversation on WhatsApp going to be like accessed by the government? Um, just reconfirming that could be something that gives people a lot of peace of mind and empowers them to continue talking with people outside of Iran. And the other thing that builds off of that is, us in the diaspora who have connections with people in Iran who are talking with them, amplifying and being their voices. I know that like uh, there's a lot of disheartenment on our side because it feels that our advocacy doesn't have a lot of power, but we're quite literally their voices here. And we're a very highly capable diaspora, a lot of human capital, a lot of real capital, and we're seeing that have a lot of impact already. But yeah, those are just some ideas that
Great.
of how we could amplify. Yeah.
Okay, Sam, anything you want to answer here?
Yeah, to touch on the point of elite fractionalization, I think, this is a valid point. Why would the elites now break up and they haven't in the past? Well, I think we all know Iran's regime is fundamentally based on a negative selection system. It's people who are incompetent selecting other people who are incompetent to secure their position. And this creates authoritarian path dependence, a classic phenomenon. But this path dependence is sustained by rents. It's not sustained by ideology anymore. We're 45 years past the revolution. Much of this comes from very tangible effects, and these tangible benefits, the state can no longer afford to give to its closest supporters when it doesn't have the money to, when its currency is utterly devalued. And look at it this way. The IRGC, which many people point to and say, well, it seems that there's no split with the IRGC and the regime. Well, the IRGC controls, ostensibly more than 40% of the economy by all credible reports. And I think the question then becomes, how long can these people who are motivated by rents sustain their support for a regime that can't give them the money that they want or that they need? And I think that really is the framework we should be looking at this elite fractionalization with, that the regime cannot sustain its continued system of rents for loyalty when it doesn't have the money to do so. And that's exactly why it's so important, as you mentioned, as Professor McFall mentioned, as Mateen has, as everyone here has, that the pressure needs to be sustained on this regime so that they don't get footing to do what they did again a few years ago when sanctions enforcement was relaxed.
Great. Bailey?
Sure. I'd like to talk a little bit about something, a specific response to what can international actors do and what can the diaspora do. And that is related to digital evidence collection. So kind of dovetails a little bit of what Mobina was talking about, but a really important source of evidence for any future accountability or even just, establishing a record of fact of what happened in Iran under this regime, recently has been relying quite heavily on the use of digital evidence, which is essentially videos and photos that very brave Iranians are taking of alleged human rights violations committed by the regime, and then they're posting them on Telegram channels. They're sharing them on Instagram. They're posting them on Facebook and X. And these videos and photos are then being used by, international human rights experts abroad to put together case files and significant documentation to prove that the Iranian government is committing these violations. Because one thing, I'm sure everyone here knows this, but like one way that the Iranian government tries to undermine the legitimacy of the opposition is to deny that these incidents happened, or to cast doubt on the regime's responsibility for the incidents. So I think one, quite tangible thing that you can do as just an individual member of the diaspora that's online is to make sure that those videos and photos that you're seeing within your networks are saved, and that they are being sent to human rights groups that are collecting and documenting these. Mnemonic is a great source. They have a digital archive of open source potential evidence of human rights violations committed in Iran. It's focused entirely on Iran. They're an incredibly trusted international human rights organization based in Europe. It's a great potential source. The Berkeley Human Rights Center also has been collecting a lot of digital evidence, and I'll also highlight Mobina. Mobina and I did some work on allegations of chemical weapons used against, or I'm sorry, intentional uses of chemicals used against schoolgirls in Iran. But I think, you try to use your networks with digital evidence and make sure they get in the hands of lawyers and other international human rights advocates.
Thank you. All right, Mike, I promised to give you the last word, so please take the opportunity.
Well, that's very kind of you. This terrific conversation. I have so many questions, but we only have 3 minutes left. We better do this again sometime. Let me just say one thing about the history, Larry. You asked me a very direct question, and then something about transitions. So on the history, for those of you who don't know, I did work at the White House during the Green Movement in 2009. While the Obama administration was trying to negotiate a nuclear arms deal, a nuclear deal with Iran. And by the way, people often forget, but part of that was a pressure track. UN Security Council Resolution 1929, passed in 2010, the most comprehensive multilateral sanctions against the Iranian regime ever. The goal, however, back then was to eliminate the nuclear weapons program. Very explicitly, that was the goal. And I hate to quote myself, Larry, but I wrote about this in my book called From Cold War to Hot Peace, where I said, this is page 161, if anybody wants to look up the history, when we were debating this at the White House, I wrote, quote, unquote, I had a different view. As I had written with my Stanford colleague Abbas Milani, I believed that the only emergence of a democratic regime in Iran would eliminate for good the Iranian threat, including the nuclear threat. Arms controllers did not end the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Democrats inside Russia and the other Soviet republics did. I maintained the same prediction about Iran. That was me in 2009, and I believe that to this day. That was a debate in our government that we lost. But I want to add two things that are really, really important, because this whataboutism, where were you back then? Well, that's where I was, and the history will show that. But we're in a different place. That was 2009. That's 17 years ago, folks. This regime has been in place in a much more repressive way, especially in the last month. So this is not an apples to apples comparison with the dictatorship that we're talking about, number one. And number two, we were told that the Iran nuclear weapons program was eliminated. So why are we negotiating to eliminate something that's already been eliminated? I just think the context is radically different, even if than in 2009. And the third thing I need to say, especially to my Republican friends who have been doing this, two wrongs don't make a right, folks. This whataboutism, if you were against negotiating with the mullahs in 2009 and now you're for it now, just because you support President Trump, that makes no sense to me whatsoever. So I just think we should realize things are radically different compared to 2009. Time has already run out. I would just say one last thing, Larry, in terms of transitions that others were alluding to remind everybody that there are lots of transitions that I know well, that I've written about, where at this moment in history, they said, well, there's no opposition movement, there's nobody legitimate, and there's nobody to negotiate with. And then after the fact, we realized that there were. So I just want to remind people, I've heard these arguments before. Second, there have been very important pivotal interim leaders during transition that proved to be interim and not the restoration of monarchy, as Abbas was talking about. And I would just note that there are other cases that was very important about these interim leaders. And then finally, the most difficult thing to say, but there are many successful cases of transition where some really horrible people didn't go to jail. Some really horrible communists still own really nice properties in Poland today, folks. Some really horrific supporters of the apartheid regime in South Africa still are stakeholders in the economy there today. Jaruzelski in Poland played a very important transitional role. And I just would remind people of that sometimes in order to get to democracy and eliminate horrific repression, you have to do deals with these types, especially without taking over their property rights and especially without putting them in a jail. But the arc of justice can be long. And one of the transitions that's on my mind is in Chile. Pinochet didn't go to jail in the transition. He was made a senator, folks. He was part of that autocracy, and yet he was allowed to be a senator, but not forever. Eventually, justice even caught up to that guy. And I would just put that on the table as we think of different transition patterns, maybe for another webinar, to think about these other cases that sometimes tragically, to end the horrific repression, you have to deal with elements of those that were truly repressive in the old autocratic order.
Well, let me just conclude by saying that I think many of you have made the case, none more eloquently than Abbas Milani, that the regime may really be in its terminal phase, even if this phase may go on for months or a few years. And that underscores the logic and imperative of opposition forces beginning to think about questions like the one you just raised, Mike, of what's the deal going to be? What can defecting elites be offered? And what does the post-transition order begin to look like? Secondly, I think we can't close without, expressing our heartfelt condolences to and solidarity with the thousands of families in Iran today who are grieving, number unknown, and probably in the end will never be exactly knowable. It's got to be more than the 8,000 that the regime is willing to acknowledge. We don't know if it's 12, if it's 15,000, if it's 30,000. We just know it's a horrific number that must surely represent some kind of crime against humanity. So I think it's important that people in Iran know that we are grieving too. And finally, of course, thanks to all of you, and most of all to the Iranian Studies Program, to Abbas, to Roma Parhad, and all the staff there. And most of our participants are still with us, so thank you for your patience and support. Thank you all.